Good evening, everyone, and welcome. We're going to give attendees a minute or two to join us before we begin. We have great turnout for tonight's meeting. Thank you all for being here. We'll get started a minute or two after 6 o'clock. All right, good evening, everyone. My name is Ken Wire. I'm the land use attorney for HRP Group, the owner of the former coal power plant site in Old Town North, known as the PRGS site. I want to welcome you to our 20th community engagement meeting that HRP has organized to discuss the redevelopment of the site. Before we begin, I know many of you are already familiar with the Zoom format, but we'd like to quickly review a few housekeeping items before we get started. Please note that this meeting is being recorded. For those joining us on Zoom, all audience members are muted on both audio and video. This helps us move efficiently through the presentation and ensure we have time to address your questions. If you would like to ask a question or provide a comment, please use the Q&A function located at the bottom of your screen. If you do not see the Q&A icon, click on the three dots labeled More, and you should find it there. We will answer questions following the presentation, including questions that were received pre-submitted by email. The recording of the meeting and presentation slides and responses to all questions submitted tonight will be posted on our website at www.hrpalx.com. We'll do our best to answer as many questions as possible during the Q&A session. If we're unable to get to your questions due to time constraints, we will still post a written response online along with all other submitted questions from tonight's meeting. Tonight's meeting is scheduled for an hour. Our intention is to have the first 30 minutes of the team presentation answering the agenda questions we have outlined in a few minutes, and another 30 minutes for questions from the community. Our intention is to have a hard stop at 7 o'clock, given there are city council meetings and other meetings throughout Alexandria this evening. As with all of our community engagement events throughout this process, there's an opportunity for community presentation. We're here to listen to your comments, answer your questions to the best of our ability, and share important project information with you this evening. We'll be covering a lot of material. As mentioned, there'll be dedicated time for questions afterwards, so we're happy to return to specific slides during the Q&A. I do want to note that we're now 5 years into this review process, and over that time, we've covered a lot of topics in these meetings and our filings with the city. A few weeks ago at our May 4th community meeting was purposely focused on the detailed items that are being considered for council approval in June. The 2 primary open space areas and the 2 blocks to be redeveloped first, blocks B and C, as well as TIF financing. Following that meeting, we received a few questions on the timing of phasing, timing of the arts and cultural uses, environmental remediation, and deconstruction, and those will be the focus of our conversation this evening. We've discussed these topics in depth at prior community meetings, but we do understand that there may be some folks who are either new to this process or want a refresher on these topics. So we wanted to host tonight's meeting to cover them and answer any questions. Thank you for joining us tonight. We appreciate your time and effort. And with that, we'll go ahead and get started. Next slide. So as I mentioned, there are 4 outlines of this evening: the master planning, phasing, arts and culture, environmental remediation, and importantly, abatement and deconstruction, as well as next steps. Next slide. So we have used this graphic for many years, and what this summarizes is the 14-year process we've been through, starting with the power plant closing, through many of the back and forths with community groups and various commissions, and we're now ending the end of this timeline, cresting, if you will, at the Planning Commission and City Council approvals in June. Next slide. This is a graphic representation of the CDD approval that went forward in July of 2025, which is the entire zoning overlay district for this project. We did the infrastructure site plans in June of 2023. And as you can see on the right-hand side, we're now bringing forward the DSUPs for the specific blocks and open space that I mentioned earlier. Next slide. We also understand there's been some concern and questions about the phasing. This project has been broken into phase 1 and phase 2. The entire project consists of about 2.5 million feet, obviously capitalization about $2 billion. And this first phase, as I mentioned before, is for the total development of blocks A, B, and C, and approximately 1.1 million square feet. I think next slide, I turn it over to Melissa. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you, Ken. You can go to the next slide, please, Corey. Good evening, everybody. I'm Melissa Schrock, and I lead the mixed-use development team at HRP. I've had the opportunity to meet many of you at our prior community meetings, on our site tours, or even at meetings with your homeowners association. So it's nice to see everybody again. As Ken mentioned, we received questions on phasing, so we wanted to review the overall phasing plan. It's important to note that in the CDD, which was approved in mid-2022, it contemplated a phased delivery of the project and the open space. The CDD divided the site into 3 phases: blocks A and B, blocks C and D, and blocks E and F. However, as we started planning and designing the first phase after the CDD was approved, we were actually focused on advancing blocks A, B, and C, meaning all of that phase 1 and half of phase 2. This kind of half phase wasn't really fully designed or defined rather in the CDD, so it became clear that we needed to refine the phasing plan to be on a block by block basis. That way, we can clearly establish the improvements that are being delivered with each block and ensure that each block is providing something meaningful. So the CDD is being amended to reflect that update. I would note that this kind of refinement is quite typical when a city has a multi-step approval process like Alexandria's. Next slide. In addition to the CDD amendment, we're seeking approval now for 4 DSUPs, one for Block B, one for Block C, one for the waterfront open space, and one for the rail corridor open space. I want to be clear that the 2 open space DSUPs are for the entirety of those 2 parks. The programming and design will be approved now. This graphic is just highlighting the areas that will be improved with blocks B and C. Next slide, please. In addition to those 4 DSUPs, we made 3 concept submissions for Block A in 2024 and 2025. That process was paused while we identify a user for that building. In the event Block A isn't complete by the time blocks B and C are open, we will deliver interim improvements to the Block A site and will activate it with temporary installations, which I will talk more about in a moment. Next slide. Our team is going to get into deconstruction a bit later on, but one question we received is how can the plant be demolished while vertical construction, and when we say vertical construction, we mean new buildings getting built, is happening at the same time. It may not be clear for anybody who hasn't visited the site, but the plant is located on the north while blocks B and C are on the south. So we have enough space to do both simultaneously, which has several benefits. Number 1, it shortens the overall duration of the construction. Number 2, it delivers the first phase and its public benefits as soon as possible. And 3, it starts to generate revenue for the city as early as possible. It's important to note that the plant will be down before blocks B and C are occupied. Next. You can go to the next slide again. So we also received some questions around the timing of the arts and cultural components. And we know that there have been some challenges in other Old Town North projects. So we wanted to review both our commitments and our strategy for ensuring success of this component. Our project will deliver arts and cultural activation in a variety of ways. First, as was contemplated in the CDD, 30,000 square feet of arts, cultural, and innovation space will be developed, half of which is subsidized at below market rents. Additionally, we've been developing a public art plan and looking at ways to reuse site artifacts in creative ways so that there's a cultural layer to the open space in addition to it being recreational. The intention is that the arts and cultural corridor on Fairfax Street extends into the site and becomes the northern terminus of the district, with the torpedo factory at the other end. Over time, we believe that the energy and activation that exists at King Street will extend northward so that the corridor becomes a thriving and unique district in Alexandria. Next slide. This is a conceptual drawing of the art plan. You can see that public art will be delivered with each block, and may include things like murals on the guardhouse at the end of Royal Street or at the pump house on the waterfront, gateway sculptures at the site entry points, and incorporation of artifacts like old train rails into landscaping gates or industrial elements into public art pieces. Next slide, please. So, located at the southern end of the site, Block A plays an important role in the extension of that arts and cultural corridor. While it was approved in the CDD as a 65,000 square foot, 5-story building, once we got into actually designing it, we concluded it would be most successful as a smaller, single-story building of about 15,000 square feet, tailored for an active user. As I mentioned, we advanced Block A through Concept 3 level of the DSUP process. And for those who attended our public meeting last June, this image may be familiar because we presented it there. Due to its unique shape and size, we think it's important to identify a user before we finish the design. So we're actively working with AEDP to identify a tenant. This may or may not be a subsidized tenant, and having that flexibility will help us to avoid some of the pitfalls other projects have faced. Given that blocks B and C won't open until 2030 and that Block A is a much smaller building, we have time to find that user, finish the design and permitting, and construct it so that it opens around the same time. That's what we're working towards. Next. Now, if for any reason Block A doesn't open at the same time, we still want to activate this important gateway parcel in a meaningful way. So we're also looking at potential interim activation strategies. These could be seasonal outdoor performances, temporary or rotating public art exhibits, or pop-up spaces that would provide local arts and small businesses an opportunity to reach new customers and grow their businesses without having to make a huge investment in building out their space or making long-term lease commitments, which can be prohibitive for new small businesses. Now I'm going to turn it over to Juliana Connolly.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Juliana Connolly, and I lead environmental remediation work for HRP Group, including here in Alexandria. You can go to the next slide. I'll just start with a little background. Some of you may have seen this in earlier presentations, but for those of you who are new, we'll start at the beginning. The property is entered into 2 cleanup programs under the oversight of the Virginia Department of Environmental Quality. One program is called the Voluntary Remediation Program, and the other is the Petroleum Program, and that's a program specific to releases from oil storage tanks. The Voluntary Remediation Program, as the program name indicates, is a voluntary program. Property owners can elect to enter into that program. And when they do so, that requires the property owner to go through a process of first assessing this property for contamination, evaluating risks, selecting remedies, and implementing remedies. And I'll talk more about that process on the subsequent slides. But the property has been enrolled in that program since 2021. We acquired the property in the fall of 2020 and then entered the property in the VRP program in early 2021. The petroleum program has a longer history at the property. The site first entered the petroleum program in 2013. So prior to our ownership, a release from 2 underground storage tanks was identified in 2013. Those USTs are shown as sort of the yellow blobs on the figure on the right here. They're USTs, underground storage tanks, that were associated with the operation of the power plant and are physically right up next to the edge of the power plant. So a release was identified in 2013. That program is not voluntary. When a release is identified, a property enters the petroleum program. The prior owner did investigate and remediate contamination in that area. But there is some physical restrictions to accessing that area because of the presence of the power plant. So we'll have an opportunity as our demolition proceeds to go in and remove some of the additional residual contamination. And I'll talk about that more. You can go to the next slide. With respect to the VRP program, The first step is what we call site characterization. And I'll just mention as I get into it, I'm going to talk through our VRP process. These reports that I'm talking about are available on our project website, which is hrpalx.com. And then there's a section that says environmental reports, and you can go in and see the specifics of any of these reports if you're so inclined. But the first step is site characterization, and that's where we go in and we collect physical samples of soil and groundwater from areas where we suspect there could be contamination. And the reason we might suspect contamination is based on what activities were occurring in different areas of the property as part of its history. So coal storage, for example, as part of this site, that's the sort of darker green area shown on the right. That's where coal was stored. So that's where a place, there's no longer coal there, but we want to go in and see if there are residual impacts to the soil and groundwater from the historical storage of coal. What the site characterization found in this case is that we have localized contamination in that, so a focused area of contamination near those underground storage tanks that I talked about that were first discovered, that area was first discovered in 2013. And then across the rest of the site, we have what I would refer to as more diffuse contamination. And what I mean by diffuse is that the contamination is at lower concentrations and it's spread out. It's not localized like in a hotspot or a target, a bullseye, where you could come in and sort of get the heart of it out. It's spread out across the site. And that's important as we think about how people could be exposed and how a remedy should be designed. The constituents that we're talking about in that diffuse contamination include metals, some lower concentrations and intermittent detections of petroleum constituents, so oil-related constituents, and then also some volatile and semi-volatile organic compounds. These are constituents that are associated with petroleum as well, but individual compounds. Importantly, I'll point out we did not detect a group of compounds that are called polychlorinated biphenyls, or PCBs. We did sample for those, but did not detect them. Additional sampling is going to occur at the site as the building comes down. We didn't have physical access to sample under the building while it's in place, just given its current status. So once that building comes down, we'll come in and do additional sampling and our site characterization. Thank you. Yes, the building is the orange highlighted area. We'll come in and do additional sampling, and our site characterization report will be updated to include those additional sampling results. You can go to the next slide. So the next step after our site characterization was what we call human health risk assessment. And this is where we quantitatively evaluate human exposures to the constituents that are present in soil and groundwater. So this is really a spreadsheet exercise where we calculate doses. So how much dirt does a child eat? And then how much of each constituent was present in that dirt? And we calculate potential risks, both non-cancer and cancer risks associated with that exposure. When we conduct a human health risk assessment, we consider both current and potential future use. So you can think of this risk assessment as considering the current use, which is relatively limited, but you might have a worker walking across the site, something like that. We also considered construction use, which is an anticipated, near-term future use. Construction workers are often some of the most highly exposed people to constituents in soil and groundwater because they have such direct contact with environmental media compared to a worker walking across the site. And then we also look at that farther in the future use of residential, recreational use once the site is built out. So the risk assessment looks at all of those things. And what the risk assessment found is that for the current and the construction use, we did not identify unacceptable risks associated with the constituents that are present on site. So those uses can proceed, and the constituents that are present in soil and groundwater don't pose an unacceptable risk. The risk assessment also found that prior to redevelopment of the site for residential use, there is remediation necessary to address metals in soil prior to that residential use. So there are metals in soil that will be remediated through our remedial action plan, which I'll talk about on the next slide. So as I mentioned, we have sort of an area of localized contamination with the petroleum that's sort of shown as the red hatched area behind the building, sort of between the building and the river. And then this yellow hatched area that I'm showing is the area where we have this more diffuse contamination. And we have different remedies for these two types of contamination because they are so different in their sort of what we would call nature and extent, the type of constituents and sort of where they're physically located on the site. So for the petroleum impacted area, the remedy will be excavation and offsite disposal. Again, the prior owner has already sort of remediated the oil that they were able to get at while the building is in place. But because of our redevelopment, we'll have an opportunity to come in and get at that residual contamination that's left. So once that building comes down, and we're in there doing deconstruction and construction work, we'll be able to come in and take out that material. And I just sort of got at the point there that the timing of that excavation will occur in coordination with deconstruction and construction activities. This contamination is physically located close to the building. It's also sort of intertwined with some other subsurface infrastructure associated with the power plant. There are tunnels in that area. There's lots of things sort of overlapping in that area. So as that infrastructure is decommissioned, some of that residual material will come out. This area is also co-located with a planned subsurface garage. So as we're excavating for that garage, we'll be able to remove this residually impacted material. But so for that red hatched area, that is our plan, is to physically remove that material. It will be transported offsite for disposal at an appropriate receiving facility. For the more diffuse contamination, which I mentioned, the human health risk assessment really identified metals in that diffuse contamination as the issue that needs to be addressed. Those impacts will be addressed really through capping, or what we refer to as engineering controls. But the simple way to think about it is that the development components themselves, so things like roadways, sidewalks, building slabs, landscaped areas, those development features will all cover this diffuse contamination so that people cannot touch the underlying contamination. In addition to that, our development plans involve a large amount of export of soil from the property to allow for construction of subsurface garages. So a lot of this diffuse contamination will be removed just because of those development plans. So not as like a remedial approach specifically, but just because of the development, that soil will be removed. So it's just whatever is left over of that diffuse contamination will be managed to make sure that it's located under a development component that will serve as a physical barrier. And because those development components really are the remedy for the diffuse contamination, the remediation will be completed sort of as the same time as the development proceeds. And as the development of each block is complete, the remediation of each block will also become complete because of that intertwining of the development and the remediation. You can go to the next slide. This last slide here really just serves to integrate like the two programs and the process through these regulatory programs that we're in. So both sort of start with an eligibility or an entry point. So under the VRP, it's really, are you eligible? Some sites would not be eligible for a VRP. They're not appropriate for a voluntary program. So more highly contaminated sites or sites that need more oversight from a regulatory agency wouldn't be appropriate for a voluntary program. So VDEQ has to approve your entry into the voluntary program. So as I mentioned, we did enter the VRP program in 2021. And then for the petroleum program, your eligibility really is, did you have a release of a petroleum constituent? And again, the site's been in that program since 2013. And then both programs follow a similar process that I just walked through for the VRP of sort of characterization, risk assessment, remedy selection, remedy implementation. The words, the names of those stages are slightly different between the two programs, but they're very similar processes. And so for the VRP, we're really in that submittal stage where we've prepared those reports, but we haven't implemented the remedy yet. The reason for that, as I mentioned, is we're going to go back and get some more data as the building comes down, one, and two, the remedies are really going to be implemented as development proceeds. So that green highlighting is indicating that that's the stage that we're in for the VRP program. After that submittals, we'll have VDEQ review and comments. We'll address their comments, and then we'll go to implementations of the remedies. For the petroleum, I'm showing that's where we are. We're really in the implementation process now for that first remedy, the remedy that the prior owner initiated. We're continuing ongoing monitoring associated with that remedy. But in the future, after the building comes down and we're ready to do that additional excavation that I mentioned, we'll sort of start again with that implementation of that secondary remedy, that excavation and offsite disposal. And then both programs have sort of a regulatory closure process with a VDEQ sign off. Again, different names, but they both sort of walk through a similar process. And then I'll hand it over to Ken to talk through how those VDEQ programs sort of align with the city's review process.
Juliana, thank you for that detailed summary. We knew there were a lot of questions from the community after our last meeting, so we wanted to spend the time to do that. Just very briefly, this bubble diagram here is nearly identical to what we have used with Robinson Terminal North and other projects I've worked on. And obviously, we all can read the bubbles. The preliminary DSUP was approved in final site plan. We submitted various different reports as part of the final site plan. The city is reviewing them now. And there's community involvement through those processes where we go out and explain how things are done. The one thing I want to make clear to everyone is the VRP is a state-led program where the developer working with the city and the state come up with these programs to make sure we manage and deal with all contamination at various phases. I won't spend any more time on this slide than that. We're nearing the end of our half-hour target, so we'll try to speed up here a little bit as a team as we go to the next slide. Okay, abatement and deconstruction. Over to you.
Thank you, Ken. Hello, everyone. My name's Nick Polaire with the HRP team. I'll be speaking tonight about abatement and deconstruction. Next slide, please. Our abatement and deconstruction approach is pretty straightforward. First, we will go into all the buildings, remove any regulated materials that we've surveyed and identified. And at the end of that process, we'll receive clearance letters where we have third-party inspectors come through and clear that the buildings are safe for deconstruction and next steps in the process. And then as we deconstruct the buildings, we're going to be using a mechanical dismantlement or mechanical takedown method. We won't be using any implosions or felling of the buildings where we kind of topple everything over. We won't be doing that. We'll be taking it apart piece by piece, which we'll show you a few images and a few other slides here. And then real quick, just a little bit of our experience. We've abated and deconstructed over 300 acres of coal-fired power plants. For previously, this will be our fifth as an HRP team. We've also decommissioned and deconstructed a 1,300-acre oil refinery, and then about 20 acres of commercial buildings. Next slide, please. A few of our mitigants that we'll be putting in place as we complete abatement and deconstruction, which we have spoken to on many meetings previously, but rodent control be in place before we start any activities on site. We'll follow local city regulations for noise control to make sure we're being a good neighbor. We'll be doing vibration monitoring at the perimeter of the building, make sure our efforts on site are not affecting anything off site. As always, an ample amount of dust control and monitoring. A lot of water will be used inside the buildings as well as outside the buildings as we do abatement and deconstruction. And then I touched on our abatement approach a few minutes ago. And then most importantly, we've committed to having additional communications via community meetings specifically on abatement and deconstruction, as well as presenting some of our plans as we move forward here in the upcoming months as we start this process to get into deconstruction and abatement. Next slide, please. So here's just a few examples of what you may see as we start to deconstruct the power plant and the other buildings on site. So just what we call a high reach excavator. So it's just got a long boom and giant scissors essentially on the end of it. That'll be able to cut different pieces off and bring that to the ground, and then using ample amount of water on the right side to knock down the dust that may be created from those activities. Next slide, please. And then this is a slightly different example of the same type of technique, but with structures that are a little more similar to the power plant at PRGS. And this may be the actual piece of equipment that is coming to the project. And then I will turn it over to John Newhall with HRP to speak to sequencing.
Thank you, Nick. Hey, everybody. This is a sequencing plan that you've seen before. It was developed with our GC partner, Balfour Beatty, who is leading site logistics and safety during the deconstruction and the vertical work that Melissa had mentioned. At a high level, this outlines our sequencing approach to deconstruction. As Melissa mentioned previously, it's a phased plan that allows vertical construction to progress concurrently while deconstruction is still ongoing. We have added an outline in here to this slide for clarity. So in the light blue within the dark blue area, the light blue shows the footprints of blocks A, B, and C within the sequence area A that is in that darker shade of blue. The phasing of deconstruction generally moves from a south to north directionally, starting with the smaller structures associated with the coal silos and conveyors that are in that coal yard. Then there's also a small area on the north that you can see in darker blue adjacent to the turbine house and Pepco switch yard. That is a part of Sequence A that allows site access and logistics to flow throughout the project. Next slide, please. So this slide summarizes the sequencing and timing discussed previously and helps provide a clear visual representation of the overall project progression, beginning with deconstruction activities and continuing through the commencement and completion of the vertical construction for blocks B and C. Drawing your attention to the bottom here, bottom of this slide, and that kind of the Gantt chart view, Sequence A deconstruction activities will be completed as work transitions into the Sequence B area of deconstruction. It's at that time, at the completion of Sequence A, the deconstruction is out of the way, and at that time, vertical construction would be able to start at Block B, which is the first building we would be starting on, while the remaining deconstruction sequences will continue to advance concurrently with vertical construction operations on both Blocks B and C. So based on this current schedule, you can see that Building B, the first to receive occupancy, is anticipated to require 27 months to complete. And as a result, that deconstruction it will be very much substantially complete well in advance of that first building delivery. I can go to the next slide. So lastly, Nick mentioned it, but just community communication, I can't reiterate that enough, that it's just such an important part of who we are here at HRP. We adopt a good neighbor approach. Here we are in community meeting number 20. And as Nick mentioned, we'll continue to have public communications up to the start of deconstruction and more deconstruction specific meetings. And then just highlighting the website. I've been in this industry 20 years and have been involved in other coal-fired power plant deconstruction here. And I can tell you the website that has been produced here is better than anything I've seen before. It has a 24/7 hotline for immediate questions, concerns, general inquiry areas, as well as weekly updates, 3-week look aheads of any ongoing work and any logistics changes on site. And in addition to that, the dust monitoring that Nick had mentioned, those monthly dust monitoring reports actually get posted monthly real time for full transparency to you all. And I think from here, I'm going to head it over to Ken.
All right. Thank you, John. I appreciate everybody's detailed summaries. I'm going to call Melissa with our team up on camera. I will do the best I can to summarize the comments. We have over a dozen questions submitted during this conversation,
Great.
as well as some that were submitted beforehand that we'll do our best to answer in the next 25 minutes. Melissa, grouping the first comments together was, what has changed in HRP, and can we talk about the money spent in deconstruction? Is there anything from a regulatory standpoint has changed since you've started this project?
Yeah, from a regulatory standpoint, I would say things haven't really changed, but some important context or economic context has changed since we first bought the power plant. If the question is directed towards the TIF, which I think it is, I'm not entirely positive, Ken. You know, since the time of acquiring the power plant, obviously materials and construction costs have escalated pretty dramatically. Interest rates as well have gone up. I'm sure everybody's very, very aware of that. And then additionally, after COVID, the office market has not recovered in the way that people had initially thought that it would. So those are some of the reasons that we made the proposal to the city and have been working with them on the TIF proposal.
And Melissa, just because we're on that topic, I'm going to bounce back and forth. There was a question about, how does the city analyze TIFs? And there's a sort of a tried and true. This is my 5th tax abatement I've been involved in the city, and we call it the but-for test. And Melissa, maybe you can just quickly describe the detailed process the city staff goes through as they evaluate any proposal to accommodate a TIF structure.
Well, it sounds like you may be the resident expert, but I'll do my best. Yeah, so first of all, a third party was engaged, right, to analyze the costs that are involved, but then also the revenue, right? The revenue streams that are going to be resulting to the city as a result of the development. And then we hired a third party to produce those studies, and the city has used their own in-house staff, but also their own financial and legal advisors to evaluate what was proposed as well. So it goes through a very, very thorough vetting process, and the costs that the TIF is essentially enabling are related to kind of unlocking the development site. There's nothing private, like none of the buildings or, the apartment buildings or the condominium buildings, the retail, none of that is being covered by the TIF. It's really the public related costs. So the open space, the infrastructure, those kinds of things. And Ken is right. The city employs a but-for analysis when deciding whether or not any particular project should be considered for this kind of tax increment financing. And the analysis is essentially like, but for this, public financing component, the project would not advance. So that was the analysis that they did.
So Melissa, this is going to be a little stark as I sort of go in order to keep myself in line here, but it wouldn't be Old Town without James asking a question about the historic nature of the buildings and brick background as Old Town. And I think having my office kind of at the inflection point between Old Town North and Old Town sort of traditional, maybe you can give just a minute or two response to that, as this is obviously part of the DSUP plan set for this architecture that definitely leans a little more modern, if you will. But go ahead and maybe answer James' question.
Sure. So I think, we've tried to strike a balance. Obviously, we're building buildings in, 2020, 2030. They are not buildings of 150, 200 years ago. I think it's important context to understand that the Old Town North Small Area Plan envisioned this level of density on the site. So by its very nature, this development has always been going to be a denser, taller type of development than what we might see along King Street in Old Town. It's also in Old Town North, not in, the very heart of Old Town, and there are a number of, more contemporary buildings around us. What we have tried to do as it relates to the design is to provide more what I would call contextual buildings on the city side as you're sort of entering the site from the south or from the west. And the strategy is they get a little bit more modern or dematerialize as they move towards the water. But you'll also notice, and this image is a good one here, that one of the things we've really paid attention to is the ground plane. And we've learned lessons and actually studied the kind of rhythm and the scale of the storefronts that you see in Old Town, because they're obviously very charming and they're attractive to people. And that's one of the things that we've sort of replicated in our designs. And those ground floors where the retailers are also designed to be masonry for the most part.
Thank you, Melissa. I'm going to summarize the next two comments together, which take us back towards the environmental concerns. Both Mary Harris and Keith Mines asked a question about how do we ensure people are safe during deconstruction, and how do we ensure that future tenants of the area won't be exposed? And how I've always answered that is both the city and the state DEQ look at how the building is going to be taken down and the worker safety and the safety of the surrounding area. So what that does is that looks at the contractors working and the homeowners around and say, if you run into this scenario, you do this. If you run into that scenario, you do that. So make sure the building's taken down in a safe manner. And at the end, it's oversimplified, but as our team, Juliana, mentioned, the site will be covered with clean fill to ensure people using the open space, using the trails, are shielded, if you will, from the environmental impact. So we can bring Juliana on later if there's more details, but that's how I've summarized that. And that structure is something that's been tried and true in the Commonwealth for many, many years. I think we've answered the question about have we ever remediated a building and deconstructed a building while construction is taking place on the same site. It's not unprecedented. This is something that our team walked through, especially given that the building, power plant building, is in a different site than the first two buildings, B and C. But obviously the structure will be coming down in accordance with Juliana's earlier description. Alexandra asked a question about interior. I'm sorry, Melissa, were you going to correct any of that?
Well, Nick or John may want to just jump in here. I mean, in Philadelphia, where we deconstruct a 1,300-acre oil refinery, that actually took several years to get that down while we started vertical construction. In Boston, the facility that we demolished, we did so while protecting some historic buildings on the site. And ensuring that they survived an extensive demolition process in a very urban area, adjacent to essentially a residential neighborhood, similar to our context here in Alexandria. So we do have good experience with these kinds of challenging demolition projects.
Thank you, Melissa. John, maybe I'll tee you up. There's a great question here about the water we're using to contain the dust and how we keep it from going into the river. I know the city has very strict discharge requirements into the water. We'll be building stormwater ponds and have a means and methods detail ironed out in the final site plan. I didn't know if you had anything extra to add to that, but that's something that is clearly reviewed by both the state and the city. But chime in there if I missed any of those.
Yeah, no, I think you hit most of it on the head. I think the only other thing to add is, during that abatement work, that water gets controlled and encapsulated and does not, that doesn't run off into any catch basins, doesn't run off back into the Potomac River. That all that water gets captured at the scene and disposed of. I don't know if Nick, you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, just on the abatement side, and John, I think you're spot on there, but during abatement, step number one, after we identified where the asbestos is, we actually build containment. So we'll section off the insides of the buildings with series of plastic tarps, etc., and completely seal off the areas that we're working in, including sealing off any drains or sewers that may exist inside or outside the buildings that we're working in, on, or around. And then during the deconstruction, same practice. We will, kind of safe off or kind of bifurcate the stormwater drains, which we have mapped. We know where everything goes on site generally to make sure that we're not sending any, quote unquote, dirty water back to the river. We want to protect that. So.
Well, Nick, while I have you up, I'm going to bounce forward to a question that's related. It talked about will there be two teams responsible for environmental monitoring, one above and one below. I believe you have one larger contractor and one consultant, but maybe you could clarify that in case I mischaracterized.
Yeah, so this might be a two-part answer, but on the abatement deconstruction side, the team that John and I will be working with, we handle everything above grade generally.
Okay.
So abatement is about removing regulated materials from the buildings. Remediation is really everything, at and below grade. Juliana can opine on that more if she would like. But Balfour Beatty has been selected as the general contractor who will oversee the deconstruction and abatement work, as well as horizontal and vertical construction, or as the buildings, come up out of the ground. And then there will be, an abatement contractor, deconstruction contractor, under them, who are specific experts in those two fields of work as we go and do that abatement and deconstruction work on site.
Juliana, you want to clarify any of that?
Yeah, I'll just add to what Nick is saying, just made sure there's not any uncertainty from the question in terms of monitoring. So what Nick is talking about, above grade, below grade. So I would also pose it this way to people. If you think about abatement is removal of building materials and other components that were put in the building on purpose to do a job. Okay, so asbestos, for example, was put on the building materials on purpose for insulating purposes within the building. It was there intentionally. It's not a contaminant. It wasn't a spill. It wasn't a release. It's there to do a job. But now that the building is coming down, it needs to be removed safely before the building comes down so that it doesn't cause a release. It doesn't get released to the environment. Okay, so that's the abatement. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about abatement, is removing materials that are there on purpose so that they don't get released to the environment. When we're talking about remediation, which Nick was referring to as below ground, those are releases to the environment that did not occur on purpose. Okay, the oil release that I talked about, that's a release to the soil and groundwater that was an accident, that was not on purpose. We're not talking about removing things that had a purpose. So that might be helpful for people to think about. They're different regulatory programs in terms of how you address these things because of sort of the nature of how they got to be where they were. In terms of the monitoring, a lot of this work will be conducted through our general contractor, but the monitoring, both our dust monitoring, our perimeter monitoring, our groundwater monitoring, there'll be multiple parties, environmental consultants, all working under contract to HRP Group as the owner. So there'll be multiple people. But in terms of that dichotomy of the two different things, you can think of it as above and below, but it's also this stuff that was on purpose being removed before demolition and stuff that was released to the environment. Just different regulatory programs because of what the conditions are.
Thank you, Juliana. There's questions I think are related, which is how long will the Mount Vernon Trail be closed and how does this impact bike connectivity? I'm not sure if that's Michelle on our team working closely with or in the contractor teams to answer that one.
Currently, the Mount Vernon Trail is not closed. There was a closure at one point. HRP was working with a Park Service consultant, subcontractor, who was doing some emergency shoreline work, but that has since wrapped up.
Thank you. There's another question about traffic study results. They are posted on the city's website. I'm not going to go through that. That's a very detailed conversation, but the city now analyzes traffic results as part of the master plan, as a part of the CDD, and then we, of course, do that as part of the DSUP. So I encourage you to look to the city website where our traffic results are posted. There's a combination question. I'm not sure who on our team would answer this. What was any skittishness for future stores moving in, do the environmental remediation? And I usually answer that as we're years away from picking tenants, but if we follow the VRP, the Commonwealth has a good track record of proving that it's safe for future tenants. I don't know, Melissa, if you had anything you wanted to add to give some context.
Yeah, no, I think I certainly understand the genesis of the question. I think hopefully folks, heard very clearly from Nick and John and Juliana today all of the procedures and processes that will be employed so that the site can be essentially put back into beneficial use for economic development, for commercial and residential tenants and users in the future. And we have found on other sites that actually people, once they understand the details and the work that has been done, are excited to be part of that story. It's pretty unique to be a business and be part of what is essentially sustainable redevelopment of these former fossil fuel based sites, and we find that most people are excited to take part of it.
Thank you, Melissa. Michelle, I'm going to bring you back up for James's question about the bikes. Apparently, we didn't get his question correct. It was about moving through the site, including north-south. Obviously, porosity through the site for both bicyclists and pedestrians is a key benefit of this project. We have that worked out in our site plan. Maybe we can talk about that just for a minute, given the great answer we have towards the final product.
Yeah, actually, I think I'm going to punt to Sasha, who is one of our transportation engineers. She can answer this question, and I saw that there were a handful of other questions that she may be able to answer as well.
Sure.
Sure, yeah.
Sasha.
So I can speak to just overall connectivity just to start. So the redevelopment of the site will require an entire new roadway network throughout it. So it's contemplated in the Old Town North Small Area Plan, which connects to the existing neighborhood to the north and to the south of the property through connections at Slater's Lane, North Royal Street, and North Fairfax Street. In terms of bicycle connectivity, the project will extend and connect the local bicycle network by providing on-site, on-street bicycle facilities, which will ultimately connect the project directly to the local bicycle network. And then it'll also provide bicycle lanes on Slater's Lane. That will serve as a connection or an extension, apologies, of the existing facilities that are on Slater's Lane to the west of GW Memorial Parkway, completing that local connection. And all of these improvements will complement the city's planned improvements, including a connection to the Potomac Avenue Trail from East Abington westwards, as well as other trail improvements along East Abington Drive between Slater's Lane and the multi-use trail to the south. So hopefully that answers your question overall.
Yes, and I'm just going to note a couple fair questions about exciting to see redevelopment, and also questions about when we can buy purchase units when they go more info. I believe, Melissa, we will not be shy about marketing the site, but we're certainly a little farther away from getting people up and moving in. But this is obviously an important part. I don't know if you want to give any order of magnitude response to when we hope people will be moving into these projects in the coming years.
Yeah, as I mentioned early on in the presentation, blocks B and C will probably be opening in 2030. So we will probably start pre-sales for those units in 2029. But appreciate your interest, and we are more than happy to take your contact information and hand it to our sales team when we are ready to do that.
Thank you, Melissa. As far as positive stories, Melissa, I'm going to bounce to some of the earlier questions that were submitted in advance. There was a question about affordable housing. I do want to direct everybody to the city's website. They do a great summary of the affordable housing program, and we did have many detailed meetings with the Affordable Housing Advisory Committee. Melissa, maybe we can toot our own horn how we were able to work through the great public benefits for the site, not just open space, but clearly the significant affordable housing units on site, as well as the financial contribution.
Yeah, maybe Corey, can you go to slide, I think it's 50. Oh no, sorry, I'm looking at the wrong slide. I want to find, no, not 50. Not sure where we put it, but that's okay. Stay on the Q&A slide. I can't quite find it, but I think it's important for folks to understand what was committed to in the CDD, that we've actually developed a three-pronged approach to the affordable housing component. Number one, there's a payment component, a voluntary. Oh, great. Thank you so much for finding this for me. A voluntary payment component that's part of the city's approach. In addition, we agreed to 58,000, a little over 58,000 square feet of affordable units that will be developed on site. Now, those are going to be on site in the market rate buildings, distributed in those buildings. So they're distributed across phases and across blocks within the buildings. And then I would say uniquely, at the time this project agreed to set aside 100,000 square feet of the bonus density to pursue a public-private partnership with the City of Alexandria. That's a creative component of the overall strategy. That would be a dedicated affordable housing building. That building will be part of our future phase, one of our future phases, and we anticipate with that square footage we can achieve about 100 units in that. So all told, you'll get about 160 affordable units across the site, in addition to significant payments.
Melissa Kunin, good to see you, Melissa, asked a question about sequencing, and I believe that was such a question we heard beforehand. Can we go back to the slide for a second? They wanted to describe one more time how we are doing the sequencing. And I believe we discussed it pretty overarchingly, but the idea is that taking down the power plant building goes first, and then we'll be building south to north with blocks B and C. And I do want to I want to basically try to correct some of the misconceptions maybe about the delivery of product or benefits. It will be delivered concurrently with each block. If you go through and look at the CDD plans, we are delivering open space concurrent with each block. So the benefit is as we build and close out blocks, the adjacent open space will be delivered. So it's not as if we're kicking something to the end. People will be getting the public benefits in lockstep with each individual block. I don't know, Melissa, if you wanted to clarify any of that, but we had a couple questions asking us to reiterate our development sequence. But hopefully that answers your question, Melissa Cunin. There's another question. This is a good question. I don't know how to answer this one. This is about, is there anything out of the ordinary or a method for abating fly ash in the stacks? I believe that's probably no different than the building itself. There's obviously different materials in the building. I don't know, Nick, if there's anything special about the stacks, but I assume it's part of the building and also covered by the VRP. Maybe you could clarify that in case I'm oversimplifying it.
Yeah, I mean, we have identified some residual material in those structures, and no different than we're doing abatement or regulated material removal anywhere else. We'll take, extreme precautions in doing that and make sure that it's containerized appropriately and then disposed off at a, licensed facility as required. So we'll have more details on the actual means and methods of that as we get, closer to implementing that work in the future and present that in our community meetings that we've talked about previously.
Okay.
Ken, I think there are a few questions here on traffic that
Yes.
Sasha may want to answer. So there's a couple that are asking us to post the multimodal transportation study, which we can get the link for and put it in the chat. It is posted. It's posted on our site and also on the city's website.
Sasha, anything you want to add to that? I think we've done a pretty consistent job in compliance with all city analytical standards, and we're sort of proving out which prior studies showed, and we're building on that with some of the detail from some of the finer grain turning movements. And that's how I describe it to the community. But maybe you could give a summary of any takeaways if you clarify that.
Yeah, so we all, as you both noted, the studies are posted online and available to review and the results as needed. The only thing I'll just add is that there is also a commitment as part of the CDD to update the transportation analysis again halfway through vertical development. So that will be a brand new study using most current data and reflect, the updated traffic conditions as well as additional forecasting and add that the development context that's available at that point in time. So there will be an update to the study in the future.
Melissa, if it's okay, I'm going to go back and do my best for some new comments that are coming in about affordable housing. Obviously, that has been a key focal point for the City of Alexandria. There's about a question about the different layouts and if they're being classified as affordable. How I answer that is the city has a 20-year policy that the affordable units need to be laid out and dispersed through the building in a way that when you walk by it, you don't know it's an affordable unit. When Melissa and her team goes through final site plan, we'll further refine the units and identify them. And especially for the rental buildings, they will move around as people begin to use units and vacate them. So it is a tried, true, and well-respected policy throughout Virginia to blend those in with the other units and disperse them throughout the building. As far as finishes, they need to be almost identical in finishes, especially for the rental building. It's pretty straightforward. They are all the same type of
not
units,
almost identical. They are identical. I just want to be clear. The units for blocks B and C have the unit types have already been selected by the city, and we've gone through the approval with the city's affordable housing office and received the endorsement of AHAC a couple weeks ago. So the distribution of the units for B and C, because those are the only two blocks that are known right now, the future blocks are not yet designed, is already approved. And
clarification.
They will be there. They are exactly the same as any other unit in those buildings. Obviously, they're specific unit types. And I should make a note that the distribution of those unit types was also proportional to the overall. So in other words, like if we have 20% one bedrooms, 20% of the affordable units being provided in that building are also one bedrooms. And that was something that the city wanted, which we complied with.
Thank you, Melissa. Alexander pointed us back to a comment about the option to have the interior surveyed. Melissa and our construction team, the city has a longstanding policy of allowing that to be options for adjacent owners. It helps protect you and us That's something that's been around the city for at least the beginning of the waterfront plan. I don't know if there's any details you want to provide on that, but it's something we work out in final site plan. But it is a sort of city standard operating procedure that helps everybody start from the same set of facts.
Well, that it may be, it's also just part of our process. It's just good practice.
Yep.
And what it is what's called a pre-construction survey, so that and residents are not required to submit to this, but they may ask us to come into their units and do pre-construction surveys. We will survey the buildings adjacent to us before we start.
So Slash, I'm going to bring you back up. I know we've got a minute left, but traffic. So where we are now is we're cresting towards the DSUP. There's questions about traffic routes through the city, and I know that's answered in the final site plan, so we don't have that absolutely nailed down yet, but maybe you could answer that as one of our last questions before I give it to Melissa to close us out.
So just to clarify, we're talking about where the actual site traffic is planned to kind of disperse throughout the existing roadway network.
No, the question about construction traffic entrances that came in from Barbara and David, just asking if you have an idea about where the construction entrances be located and how will that be managed?
Yeah, I might have to punt that to someone at HRP.
Yeah, I'd be
else.
happy to jump in on that one. We're going to continue to work with the city through our what's called a construction management plan, or CMP. You hear us talking about, but this site will be hit from really both sides. You're going to have to hit it from the south and north to create a flow and not inundate one entrance in. So we'll have there'll be a connection on Slater's Lane. I was showing on the sequencing plan how we had to create a road out to Slater's Lane, as well as on the south on North Fairfax Street.
Thank you, John. Well, I do want to note that we're at 7 o'clock. I do want to thank the community. These are thoughtful, appropriate questions.
Sorry, Ken, I just saw one pop up that I do feel we should address before
please go ahead.
Close out. There's a question in here about the 100,000 square foot building has never been cited. So that's the 100,000 square foot affordable building. And there seems to be a misconception that that's going to go into the open space somehow. So I just want to disabuse anybody of that false impression. That is not true. What is true is that we haven't picked which block that building is going to go on. It's not going on B or C, which was always anticipated that it would not be part of the first phase of development, but it will go on one of the future blocks, either D, E, or F. It's not going in the open space. It's not going in the roadways. It's not going in any of the parks. It will be on one of the future blocks. It's not going to diminish the open space at all. It's going to be part of the project.
Thank you, Melissa. So I do want to note where we are in the process. We are working towards the hearings, as I mentioned, in June for both Planning Commission and City Council. Those are important dates for HRP as we move through the next phase. All these questions are entirely appropriate. And as we mentioned, we will answer anything we did not get to. Looks like I answered about 35 questions, and there's a few open ones. But given the City Council hearing that started a few minutes ago, try to respect everyone's time, we hope that this forum and our ability to spend over half hour answering questions answers as many questions as we can. So we thank you for your continued due diligence and paying attention to this important site. I know myself, I'm very interested in working with HRP as we continue to move forward from entitlement to final development. So thank you for your time, and we look forward to working with the community and continuing the conversation that HRP started many years ago. Thanks again.